What's up, Solo fam? My name is John Solo, and you are watching Messed Up Origins. If you're new to the channel, basically what I do here is take your favorite stories from when you were a kid and figure out where they came from. I answer questions like, who was the original author? Where did they come up with the story? Was it a completely organic creation, or were they told a similar version as a kid and just adapted it? Well, the folktale we're covering today has some very unique answers to those questions, but who would expect anything less from the legendary lumberjack Paul Bunyan? After all, according to myth, this guy was so powerful that he single-handedly carved the Grand Canyon simply by dragging his axe behind him when walking through a snowstorm. Not only that, he and his ox's footsteps made the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota. Then, when he couldn't find a suitable watering hole for the bovine, he dug the Great Lakes. Yep, the giant woodsman has been a fixture of American folklore for a while now, and he's become such a staple that some of our most influential artists have taken it upon themselves to reimagine his story. But what's so interesting about Bunyan, at least to me, is that despite his prominence in American culture, I've never heard anyone get credit for his creation. And the reason for that is he may have been a real person. I am stoked that I get to unpack this mystery with you guys because it's one of the most unique origins I've encountered in the 58 episodes that make up this series. And now, Solo fam, gang, army warriors, it's time for us to begin. Make sure to smash that like button with all your heart so we can reach our stretch goal of 69 likes, and subscribe if you haven't already to get new content just like this delivered to your sub box on a regular basis. So the legend of Paul Bunyan had a very weird beginning. See, in the 1800s, he was just a folk hero whose legends were shared by lumberjacks in the state of Wisconsin. While they partially served as a way for the loggers to entertain each other, the fantastic exploits of the mythical lumberjack were more often told to camp visitors and newcomers who weren't yet familiar with life in the woods. With the intention of entertaining and amazing the newbies, the woodsmen would tell the unbelievable stories as if they had all actually happened to see how much they could get them to believe. And being fully committed to the shenanigans, the oldest loggers would swear that back in the day, they either knew Bunyan or members of his crew to, add some validity. Personally, I find that hilarious because even if you didn't believe their claims about this 7-foot-tall lumberjack with superhuman strength, what were you gonna do? Call out the veteran logger for being a liar when you're the greenhorn in the group? As time went on, these tall tales spread from Wisconsin to logger camps all around the Midwest, and as the workers migrated across the country and to Canada, the legends became even more commonly known and began to evolve. Then, in 1901, a fella named William Laughhead was introduced to the myth while staying with three brothers in a logging camp in the Pacific Northwest, and it gave him an idea. 7 years later, in 1908, he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota as a public relations director for the Red River Lumber Company. And in 1914, Laughhead was the first person to put stories about Paul Bunyan into print when he launched a new advertising campaign where he published 5,000 brochures titled Introducing Mr. Bunyan of Westwood, California, and sent them to his company's business partners. Mixed in with pictures and descriptions of the company's products were a handful of the Paul Bunyan stories Laughhead had heard, rewritten using advertising language. However, there were a few problems with this campaign. To start, at that time, the only people who had heard about Paul Bunyan were loggers, and the business partners he sent the brochures to put it bluntly, couldn't have given less of a shit. In the words of Laughhead himself, there were even a lot of people in the logging business who had never heard of Paul Bunyan. When it got to the wholesaler and lumber dealer and the manufacturer who was buying the lumber for factory purposes, they didn't know anything about Paul Bunyan, and there was all kinds of confusion. Sounds like a complete swing and a miss, right? Well, determined to make Bunyan the new face of Red River Lumber, he actually doubled down and launched another campaign. The company started selling a kind of wood labeled Paul Bunyan's pine, they bought advertisements using the lumberjack as their logo, and they even released a second pamphlet with more fleshed out stories to familiarize the customers with him. But once again, the results were underwhelming. Not only were the customers kind of meh about the whole thing, because why would anyone care about a lumber company mascot's backstory? In addition to making up his own tales for Paul Bunyan to star in, he invented additional characters which had virtually no appeal, and he also made the lumberjack a literal giant instead of just a freakishly huge strong guy. What's crazy is that Laughhead's iteration of Bunyan was so off base from the original folklore that it caused scholars who were studying it years later to coin the term fake lore, which is used to refer to a literary invention passed off as an older folktale. And what might be the weirdest part of Paul Bunyan's legacy, the majority of the stories he appears in nowadays, including the ones I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, seem to use Laughhead's larger-than-life version of the character instead of the OG version. So at this point you might be wondering, well, if the stories you shared earlier weren't the originals, what was the character actually like? And did any researchers ever go back and take notes on the legend that didn't end up completely butchered? You'll be happy to hear I have the answers to both of those questions, and that's exactly what we're talking about next. So coincidentally, around the same time that Laughhead was flopping around trying to commercialize old Mr. Bunyan, there was a student at the University of Wisconsin who was out there collecting the original stories in meticulous detail. Her name was Kay Bernice Stewart, and she was the daughter of a timber cruiser, someone who goes into forests and collects information on the trees that grow there and how much lumber can be harvested. She just so happened to have spent many winters in logging camps in Michigan and Wisconsin, and grew up hearing about the legendary exploits of Paul Bunyan from loggers. Under the guidance of her professor, Homer A. Watt, she began strategically collecting stories from Wisconsin-based loggers in 1912. Here's what they found. Paul Bunyan was supposedly a real man who was 7 feet tall with a stride of 7 feet and was so powerful that no man could oppose him. He could outdrink any human being, had a massive lung capacity, and could knock the limbs off of trees by simply talking near them. He was also very clever, and most of the stories about him entail finding unique solutions to seemingly hopeless problems. The only known flaw of Bunyan's was that he couldn't write. He kept track of his men's hours by making notches and pieces of wood, and would order supplies by drawing pictures of what he wanted. There's actually a fun little story where that system backfired. He ordered a bunch of grindstones and got cheese wheels instead because he wasn't detailed enough. Honestly, it could have been worse. You can never have enough cheese, especially before a date. He was also joined in many of his exploits by Babe the Blue Ox, who was said to have had the strength of 9 horses and weigh either 5 or 10,000 pounds. To those of you who are curious as to why Babe is blue, fun fact, he was originally white until one winter where it snowed blue for a week straight. Babe was just sitting outside all season, and as a result, ended up being dyed blue. The same thing happened to a cousin of mine actually, but we don't talk about him. Anyway, let's move on to some of the stories they found. You'll notice that while they're all wonderful in their own special ways, they're of a different nature than the tales I mentioned earlier. The dial is cranked back, so to speak, because the loggers wanted these stories to be somewhat believable in order to fool the newbies and camp visitors. I think they're still a little too ridiculous to fool anyone in 2019 that isn't a small child, but back in the early 1900s, when access to information was far more limited and people knew far less than they know now, they were probably just within the realm of being possible. For example, the story of Pea Soup Spring. Paul had ordered a load of peas to be delivered from town, not because he wanted to test the validity of someone's claims to royalty, mind you, but to feed his crew, and the delivery man accidentally dumped them into a hot spring. Instead of mourning the loss of their food like his men were about to do, Bunyan simply added the proper amount of pepper and salt to the mixture and had enough pea soup to last all winter. Then there's the story of the jam, and by the way, these are just names that I'm giving the stories because as folk tales they didn't have official titles. After a particularly lucrative day in the woods, Bunyan was transferring some logs down the Wisconsin River when they suddenly jammed. The logs formed a mass that was a mile long and 200 feet high, so they basically clogged up the river. Some of the men tried breaking it up, but Paul told them to stand back, led Babe into the river, and shot him with a rifle. Now this wasn't like in Red Dead Redemption 2 when you shoot a cow in the head with a shotgun just to see if the head explosion physics apply to animals too. Babe didn't just let out one final moo and collapse. In fact, he barely even noticed he got shot. Babe thought the bullet hitting him was just a fly and began swinging his tail around to try and hit it. The force generated caused the logs to flow partly back up the river, resulting in them adjusting position ever so slightly, and the jam was fixed. The story I thought was the funniest I call the government pine fiasco. You see, at the end of a logging season, Paul realized he didn't have enough money to pay his crew. Apparently, accounting wasn't one of his strong suits either. To resolve this issue, Bunyan ran into camp shouting that they had been cutting government-owned pine all season and that they were going to be arrested. So basically the logger equivalent of throwing a 40 ounce on the ground and yelling, "Scatter!" Each man in the crew took whatever camp property was closest to him, and they all ran in different directions without being paid a cent for their work. Out of all the stories I read, that one makes him look the scummiest. Now those are just a few of the Paul Bunyan stories I could share with you guys, but I thought you'd be interested in hearing some of the other findings from their research and what they concluded about the lumberjack's mysterious origins. To start, did Paul Bunyan really exist or not? Well, sadly, we don't have a definite answer on that one, because while basically all of the stories about him contain impossible feats, every logger the researchers spoke to gave nearly identical accounts of the incidents and swore that he was a real person. As I said earlier, some men claimed to have either known him or members of his crew, some pointed out the locations where his exploits had taken place, and some even indicated where he was buried. Northern Minnesota, for those curious. But here's the thing, in addition to tall tales about Paul, Not that Paul, this Paul. They also heard some hard-to-believe stories about other lumberjacks who they were able to confirm were real people, so they couldn't just write Bunyan off as being totally made up. The conclusion they ended up reaching was that Paul Bunyan was probably a real lumberjack who was more skilled and clever than the average, and as a result, his fellow loggers shared tales of his impressive exploits as they went from camp to camp. Somewhere along the way, possibly after he died, the stories about him became more exaggerated and his fame began to spread. Before long, the guy had built a posthumous reputation of being the greatest lumberjack to have ever lived and was the hero of more exploits than he could have possibly carried out in his lifetime. Let me give you an example of how that could have happened. Most of the stories about Bunyan are set in the same place and are connected to one underlying event, when he somehow managed to harvest 100 million feet of pine from a single tree. Obviously, this is impossible unless maybe the tree was Yggdrasil, but the myth may have been inspired by something many loggers did back then. Because they were only cleared to work in very specific areas, on occasion a lumberjack would lay claim to a single tree, then, ignoring section lines, would cut government-owned pine for miles around. Even if other loggers saw someone doing this, they would never rat on each other and would instead make a joke out of it, saying he got all that pine from a single tree. So you can kind of picture in your head how that evolved. Maybe a logger would mention Bunyan as an example of someone harvesting more than him to throw off a suspicious foreman. "I'm telling you, boss, 1,000 feet ain't that much. I know this fella up in Wisconsin, Paul Bunyan, harvested 100 million feet of pine from a single tree. I swear on my kids." "What do you mean? Of course I have kids." What's interesting though is that despite being an American icon, not all of Bunyan's adventures are of American origin. Some are stories taken from characters of the same fantastic type from other countries. The German hero, Baron Munchausen, was one of these characters, and what's funny about him is he's based on a real-life baron of the same name who was widely known for exaggerating his own accomplishments. Some examples include riding a cannonball, wrestling a 40-foot gator, and traveling to the moon. Back in 1785, a book was published basically parodying that guy's existence, and some of the tall tales it included ended up being reassigned to Paul Bunyan when some immigrants made their way over and took hard labor jobs like cutting down trees. Fun fact, the real Baron Munchausen was not happy about this goofbag character being named after him and threatened to sue the book's author. As a result, the author remained anonymous until he died. Anything to avoid a lawsuit, right? Well anyway, due to these similarities and similarities with other folklore, it's unknown how many of the lumberjacks' classic tales started organically here in America or were inspired by stories from European immigrants. And that is about all I could dig up on our pal Paul Bunyan. There's a few more stories I could get into, but I was thinking that if there's enough interest, we could just revisit them in another episode down the line. Maybe that one could be filled with Paul Bunyan stories now that you know the origin story. In the meantime, I'm excited to see what you guys thought of his origin story because I don't know what to think about it. It was elaborate, that's for sure, and I think it's a great example of American culture and the kinds of stories we create, which apparently have been larger than life for a long time. Make sure to comment your impressions down below and give that like button a shoulder rub that's probably not appropriate for the workplace. Oh, and subscribe to have more messed up content delivered to your sub box almost every week. And if you haven't yet, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram because my sense of self-worth is directly tied to how many followers I have. Oh, and I gotta remind you one more time to check out Skillshare. Use my link down below to get yourself a 2-month premium membership for free. Do it now, thank me later. Until next time, Solo Fam Gang Army Warriors, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.